I first arrived in Ottawa 30 years ago, yes, I am that old, the first thing that everyone was talking about the need to diversify trade. There were still some elements left of the Liberals talking about Pierre Trudeau's third option. And I had left Ottawa, I came back, and here we are more than 30 years later, and we're still talking about the need to diversify Canada's trade. And I want to start the panel off by asking, you know, we take that as sort of conventional wisdom. Do we need to diversify Canada's trade? And by that, we're always talking about away from the United States or reducing our dependence. So we're going to do a first quick round about, is there actually a need to diversify the trade, or is there some other option we should be looking at? Diane.
Well, I think diversification can be geographic and also product and service mix. And I think, yeah, everybody should make sure they don't have too many eggs in one basket. I think that the US is probably the most desirable market for any country anywhere in the world to export into, and Canada has a terrific advantage, not only geographically, but through relationships and history and NAFTA. And so I would say that it's really important to emphasize the type of trade rather than, you know, getting away from the US. I think that's really a misnomer. They have the rule of law, they have a good credit rating, and there's the least amount of friction in trading with them than, say, China or any other country in the world. The other thing, though, I think that's very important to note, and that is that Canada and Sweden have the highest intra-trade. In other words, the trade we do, the exports we have, which are almost half of our economy, 80% of those are actually intercorporate transfers. They're not real export. They're not the little exporter with condiments in Toronto selling to grocery store chains in the United States. This is both directions. So it's kind of a reflection of the branch plant, but it's also a reflection of the fact that Canadians, after NAFTA, made enormous investments in the United States. The FDI by Canadians in the US is 10 times proportionate what the US FDI is in Canada because of the amount of money that went down there. So I just think that's important. I don't think it's I think we're lucky to have the position we have.
Okay, so your answer is basically
stay the course, but more product mix.
Right, okay, we'll come back to that. John.
Well, I'll take the contrary position, say we still do need to diversify our exports, but I'd say we need to do that not by relying less on the United States, not backing away from the United States, but looking for new opportunities that are out there. And we heard some comment about that in our first panel. There are important opportunities in Asia and the developing world, and even almost next door in Mexico. But I think we should also take a look, and I'll follow up on what Diane said about intercorporate trade. I think we need to look at what is the makeup of our trade really like. Because on that front, if you look at trade from a value-added point of view, rather than the conventional measure of just counting the good as it crosses the border, you come up with some rather startling differences. And the Conference Board of Canada did some very interesting work on this. So if you use the value-added method of calculating our trade rather than the conventional, first of all, exports and imports as a share of GDP drops from 35% to 25%. So we're more domestically oriented than we think. Secondly, if you break out all the components of what's going back and forth across borders, suddenly services trade goes from 16% of our total trade to 40%. Manufacturing goes from 71 to 44. Our trade with the United States goes from 69 to 61%. Our trade with the EU goes up by 2%. So, you know, we're still, the preponderance of our trade is still with the United States. But I think when we're negotiating and we're thinking about new partnerships and we're thinking about product mix, we need to look at what are we really doing in the world economy. And maybe Statistics Canada needs to get a bit more active in making this data more up to date, because basically it lags by about 5 years. But I think from a policy point of view, it's very important.
Right. Okay, we'll come back to that as well. Ailish.
So let me add just three things to those great observations. I actually cheated, Madeline. I have one slide that I hope can be brought up now to help me make this point. But first of all, to Diane's point, the problem that we do have in Canada, which is a lack of diversification of our export partners, is a problem that any country in the world would probably kill to have, because of who our major partner is. And of course, that's a fantastic economy in the United States. And of course, right now, looking out globally in terms of where global growth is going to be driven in the next 5 to 10 years, the US is certainly a bright spot. So this is a great problem to have. But my second point is that I think our lack of trade diversification, which Madeline's right, it's an issue that's been around since the 1970s, but I think it's going to become even more imperative for our firms in my generation and my children's generation. And that's because of where the global centers of demand are going to come online. By 2030, there will be 2.2 billion new middle-class consumers in the world. Half of that, over 1 billion, coming online, of course, in China. And this is a market where Canada is relatively very underexposed. And my third point would be the competition in those markets is, of course, relentless. And this slide, I think, illustrates that point perfectly. This is from a fantastic speech by Tiff Macklin, our former deputy governor at the Bank of Canada, now at Rotman. And you'll see that Canada's exposure to emerging markets is not only startlingly low compared to the United States, which is upwards of 40%, but to Diane's point about product mix, what does Canada have? Energy, agri-food, forestry products. If we could compare an apple with an apple, we might look to Australia, 50% almost of its trade going to emerging markets. So that competition, which is about having relationships in those markets, it's about having established foreign affiliates and presence, is only going to get more relentless. So I think this is the boiling frog issue. This is something that might not feel so hot right now, but 20 years from now, I think we could see this being much, having a real material impact on our standard of living.
Right. Okay. I want to go back to basically to look at. Okay, so you've given your lay of the land now, but what should we be doing? For example, you're talking about changing demand. When it comes right down to what the government should be doing in terms of trade negotiations or new trade policies, is the focus in the right place right now?
I think we can say that the government has an incredibly ambitious trade agenda, and it's getting some things absolutely right. So the new Canada-EU trade agreement, which we could perhaps talk about in more detail, I think is a huge accomplishment for the government. 500 consumers, of course, at a fantastic level of income. That's going to take now businesses to capitalize on that opportunity, and the challenges are huge, particularly because certifying and bringing up your product to regulatory standards that meet both the US and EU product standards is a material challenge with compliance costs. But we want to see, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives wants to see more activity in Asia. So we've just this week ratified in the Canadian Parliament our first trade agreement with an Asian nation, and that's South Korea. It's our 6th largest trading partner. They invest far more than we do, more than 10 times more in Canada than we do outwards to Korea. So it's a great partner. There's a lot more growth to happen there, we think. But we want to see a focus on India. We want to see a focus on Japan. And particularly where I think Canada is weak right now, which is where I think business is leading the way, is in China. It's a challenging market, but we've seen Australia conclude an FTA with China. We've seen exports from New Zealand under their free trade agreement with China increase in some sectors 5-fold. We're seeing Canadian companies having to invest, for example, if you want to export dairy products, you can't do that from Canada right now because of our supply managed system. So we've had one of our member firms make a $400 million investment in Australia in order to export dairy to China. We're missing out on those opportunities, and there's really no excuse for it. So again, I think this is where business has to show that value proposition, because we understand there are political differences, social differences, and we think those are important, but we also think that people-to-people and business linkages, I call it actually the trade theory of peace. You may have heard the democratic peace theory. I actually think countries that trade with each other find ways of mutual understanding.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I think that some of it is structural and cultural. You have a lot of Canadians in the supply management business, which is, as you point out, is actually banned from participating in the export markets. Maybe they're not efficient enough, maybe they're too expensive, I don't know. But we also have large enterprises. Some of the largest enterprises in this country are government owned. You've got your hydro utilities. They have no world product mandate to go out and build things or buy utilities in the United States or buy utilities or build things in China. So we have a lot of Canadians that are not export-oriented because they work for entities that structurally aren't export-oriented or not allowed to be. And so that's another, I mean, do you privatize your hydro facilities? Do you get rid of supply? Well, we're not going to get into TPP until we dismantle supply management. Let's make that clear. New Zealand's got a veto, and they're not going to let it happen. So that may do us a favor, but on the other hand, do we start to privatize some of the other crown corporations we have? Lottery companies, insurance companies. We have all kinds of those entities, and they're hidebound to Canada, and that, I don't think that's healthy. Certainly doesn't help on the export side.
So your recommendation is a wave of privatization of these government-owned entities?
Or keep them publicly owned, but give them an opportunity or a mandate to go out and to go forth and to build facilities, to take over things and so on.
Okay. I just want to go back to Ailish for a second, John. I'll come to you in a minute. But you know, you listed a whole number of places where you know, we need to have more focus. But governments, like any enterprises, have a limited amount of time and effort and focus to put on something. So what should be the priority? I mean, it's easy to say we should, you know, look at China and look at Japan, look at India, and that. What's the priority?
Well, I think, you know, government management time, you know, understood, right? There's only so many hours in a day. But, you know, as our GDP expands, we can expand those trade commissioner services that we see as so valuable, particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises. You know, in a way, actually don't worry about the 150 CEOs that are members of our organization, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. These are large firms at scale who have significant business presence in the region, but we want to encourage more SMEs to be exporters. And I think, you know, to Madeleine's point, you know, there's only so many hours in a day, and I think, you know, it's easy to generalize when we're up here. It's easier for me to say, you know, China in particular, because I think there's a clear path forward there. And once you unlock regulatory potential, like we've seen in some of our agri-food sectors, where sanitary and phytosanitary agreements have been critical to getting Canadian product into that market, and the exports literally just take off. So I'm saying that's a good place to invest. And I think places that are easier to do business, and I would name the United States among them, although Buy America and increasing protectionism in the United States is, of course, got to be perhaps one of the greatest threats to Canadian exports. Where it's easy to do business because of language and the rule of law that Diane talked about, that's where I think Canadian businesses, frankly, over time need less help.
Okay, you want to jump in? I can
well,
see that.
I think I'd put my you asked about priorities. Where would the priorities be? And I think I'd start with saying today I'd put a priority on Japan. Because, you know, Australia has a free trade agreement with Japan. We have a lot of product overlap in terms of what we export there. Their barriers are particularly high in the agriculture sector, so we could benefit from that. But how do we get a free trade agreement with Japan? It could either be through the TPP, or we're negotiating with them bilaterally. And, you know, in this world of competitive trade liberalization, it would be rather nice if we could have a bilateral agreement with them, especially if TPP languishes for a while, as might well happen. You know, there's no guarantee that we're going to finish TPP while President Obama is still president. There's something for later discussion. But so I think that that getting out there with Japan is really important. Secondly, I'd focus on China. Now, I think we need to have a free trade agreement with China. I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow, but people are already out there ahead of us. I think there are a lot of things we can be doing in the interim to upgrade our relationship with China. We need to do that. The government needs to stop being schizophrenic about whether we need to be worried about China or having a constructive partnership with China. And I see that as essential. There are a lot of things that can be done short of a trade agreement, and would include, you know, protocols for getting certification in China for various products that we could competitively export there now. Building relationships with Chinese end users, that's really important because they've been given more discretion now in terms of what they can import directly from abroad. And they need all sorts of things and want all sorts of things that we produce, particularly in the agri-food sector. And by the way, you know, we think of ourselves, we sort of wonder what kind of country are we when it comes to manufacturing. Well, you know, if you look at the food manufacturing as a percentage of GDP in Canada, it's larger than the percentage of GDP taken by transportation equipment manufacturing. So, you know, and this is an area of our economy where we can build for the long term, because we have a competitive supply of agricultural products and a base in our land and our water and our environment and our people that's going to allow us to occupy that space competitively for a long time. So we should build on that. And third, I would look at India, because although India is not for tomorrow, and we're having a bit of a difficult time negotiating with them, but they're looking at a lot of domestic reforms. Maybe this will create an opportunity for opening that market up, and we need to do that. So we get the trade agreements in place. That's important, but that's only the beginning. A trade agreement doesn't get you into the market. You get into the market by selling to people who buy, and particularly convincing end users that your product is something they want. And that requires a long-term investment in relationships. And we should be doing that now. You don't start that when you've got the market open. You start it when you're planning to get the market open.
Is the perception that we are doing that now, or is the perception that we're not working hard enough on is your perception?
Well, my perception is that we're not working hard enough.
Right.
And you know, there's a big difference between going on one of these sort of glamorous trade missions where, you know, you have a lot of whining and dining and you meet a lot of political people, and actually going out there in a more focused sense and meeting the end users. Because that's the people you want to come to the conclusion that they want your product. And anecdotally, I've seen some really interesting examples in China in the last month of where that's paid big dividends, and there should be a lot more of that.
I want to say that I think Canadians are very entrepreneurial and enterprising. I think they have done a tremendous job. Remember, we're really more of a B2B market. We sell business to business. We sell fungible commodities that go all over the world. We don't even know who buys our stuff. And we're very good at that. I think we're as good as anybody in the world. We've invented all kinds of wonderful high-tech things for oil extraction and minerals and mining extraction. So we don't have anything to be ashamed of. But when it comes down, I'm an entrepreneur as well, and I'm on a couple of boards. I have a friend who's a condiments manufacturer, and I said to her, should we look at China? Should you go to that trade mission? She said, China? I want Pennsylvania and Ohio. What can I sell in China? Well, how much can I sell? I don't know the language. And, you know, this is what I'm saying. We have enterprising people who are ambitious, but you're not going to get an entrepreneur to go where there's too much friction, no language in common, no rule of law, and no infrastructure for distribution. You're just not.
Okay. We're going to get
Well, I disagree with that, because I think,
Great.
you know, we're looking at selling to the United States, and of course, I'm a big promoter of looking even more intensively at what we can do in the United States, because I agree with Diana on that front. They're right there. We speak the same language. We've got a free trade agreement with them, an advanced free trade
really
agreement.
Good at doing it.
But I do think, you know, there's lots of opportunity elsewhere. I don't think we should ignore and to take if you're looking at selling some of our agricultural products, we don't want to get lost anonymously in a sea where our product can't be differentiated as a high quality product. We're backfilling the United States market now on a lot of meat and other products and they're selling to these offshore high value markets. And we could be doing that. And by going out there and getting the end users, and I'm going to leave here after this and I'm going to come back for the afternoon, but I'm going off to an opening of a Chinese supermarket chain, which is opening. Everybody says, oh, how exciting, can I go and buy there? And I said, no, they're opening their North American purchasing office in Toronto. And they want to buy things from us, and particularly in agriculture. You know, we're talking about, they don't want to buy Chinese products because they're, you know, badly polluted. They want clean, quality products. And they're very interested in sourcing in Canada. And we're crazy if we don't follow up on those kind of opportunities, because they're going to pay top dollar to get that. And that's not what we're getting in the US market for our meat products today.
That seems a bit of a mixed message, though. Like, yes, focus on the US, but no, let's look at other markets.
Go where opportunity is.
Right.
Follow the opportunity. And that will vary depending on the product and who you are.
I was going to come back to you about diversification of products because you had mentioned that as opposed to diversifying trade. Are there any that you haven't covered that you think might be worth focusing more on?
You mean that products and goods and services that Canadians can make?
Yeah.
I think there is more we can do. One of the impediments to Canada in terms of economically growing to scale so that you can become the multinational that we sell to in the US, who sells our components all over the world, is that we can't trade east and west. I mean, the United States in 1880 created the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission made the United States the biggest, huge national marketplace in the planet, and it overtook Britain within a handful of years. We can't sell BC wine in Ontario government-owned liquor stores. We have protectionist measures in we're very balkanized, so that when somebody comes to open up an office for North America, you'd think that they'd want to take advantage of a Canadian market. They can't. They come to Ontario because it's big, and then they want to get into the US. So we've never had, our manufacturers and our entrepreneurs have had to go south, and they still have to go south to get any kind of scale. And that's really been tragic, I think, for the country, and we still don't have that east-west. We'll see it now. We'll see it in living color over the fighting over the East Energy pipeline. Good luck. Will we see that pipeline in our lifetime? That's going to be interesting because all of the games that go on between provinces are going to start to go on and are already going on in back rooms. So we've been impeding ourselves from creating manufacturing and enterprises of sufficient scale to be global. So we've got to tackle that. We need an ICC, and the ICC, by the way, is a fourth level of government. It's called the Surface Transportation Agency now, but it was a fourth level of government that stopped the states from protecting themselves against other state goods and services. And it opened up, it paved up, it was the first free trade agreement in the world, actually.
Now, I know that the federal government has been talking quite a bit about this, Canada's weak version of that, the Agreement on Internal Trade, and they want to do something. Are you not hopeful that there's going to be anything that happens there?
Well, what the Americans did is that they created a fourth level of government that had political appointees that transcended the cycles of elections. And those people are inviolate, and they made decisions. They would say to Pennsylvania, you can't stop Rockefeller's oil coming in from Ohio or whatever it was if it's legal, if it's permitted. And so now we have a situation here where constitutionally, I don't even think the feds can intervene in the fact that Quebec is suing Newfoundland to prevent the Lower Churchill from competing with them, selling power to the United States from being built. And we have BC that's probably going to impede oil sands from a legal product from going through by pipeline to the Pacific. I mean, you can't have this. It's got to be dealt with, and it's got to, and right now it's a matter of the provinces, I think, are too powerful constitutionally.
Madeline, this has got to be, everyone always talks about smart policy. This has got to be one of the dumbest things Canada does to itself, is impede internal trade. And the lack of mutual recognition, for example, of standards for beer or different milk creamer sizes, or you can't you can't buy a window in Ontario and have it installed in Quebec or vice versa. So we shoot ourselves in the foot. Diane's absolutely right about the issue of getting to scale, and we need to make it easy for Canadian firms to get to scale inside our own market, for headquarters to be located here and then grow out to the world from Canada. And this is really the tyranny of the bureaucrat over the entrepreneur, frankly. I'm a little bit terrified at the idea of yet another level of government in Canada, because I think one of our problems is fragmentation amongst what we are. We're very well governed and we're over governed. And I think we need to see more consolidation. So what the Canadian Council of Chief Executives is looking for specifically in this space is and you never thought you could learn something from Europe? Well, we absolutely can. The European Common Market, one of the greatest tools there was the European Court of Justice allowing individuals to take cases on specific trade barriers. Right now, it takes 10 years and about $1 million. And I know that because we've worked with the accountants on their specific case to get mutual recognition of accounting profession standards across Canada. 10 years and $1 million to take a case. How many Canadians have that time, energy, or money? No one. So we have to have an expedited dispute settlement process let things bubble up from Canadians. Provinces need to recognize that this is an issue. Brad Dougad, the minister here in Ontario, is now the chair. Minister Moore at the federal level is quite seized with this issue. But as one minister once said to me, there's less in the internal trade agreement than meets the eye. In other words, this is kind of like less of a good thing than it should be. So I think this is a huge priority for Canada over the next year.
Can I just say that the ICC is the model? It's also preemptive. They would come down hard before complaint. And they were the final arbiter. And they were an arbiter based on commercial intelligence. Nothing to do, no politicians were on there. They were politically appointed, but they would just say, thou shalt not do that. And by the way, don't even think about it next time.
So fast sounds
So
good.
it's a fast track, it's a model. And I think that that's something that, if we don't do, we're going to continue to be picked off.
But I should ask both of you, I mean, you proposed a solution, but who's going to do it? Where's the pressure going to come from to force a change in the law like that?
You need the provinces and the feds to do this.
Right, okay.
Well, it's interesting because this has gone on for a long time now and it hasn't happened. I've sat through umpteen discussions of this. So you say that you need the feds and the provinces to do it. I'm not sure the government is really going to do it because it's uncomfortable. Let's face it. You're going to displease some of your constituents.
Is it a
and basically,
constitutional issue too?
I think so. I think, and do you know who could make it a constitutional issue?
The provinces.
Anybody. Well, a business. People don't want to take it to court, but this isn't about doing it piece by piece. All you need is one major decision that finds that that one of these barriers is unconstitutional, and you'd unlock the whole system. Now, whether the current court would come to the right decision, I don't know. By the way, I'm at a law firm, but I'm not a lawyer. So I have to be very careful when I talk about the court. This is not a legal opinion. This is a personal opinion. But I do think that that's something that ought to be seriously considered, because frankly, we've got to light a fire under the governments. Despite I couldn't agree more with the people sitting on both sides of me on this. But
the British left
how
us
do we
with a
really
pretty
make it
bad
happen?
Constitution.
Yeah,
and we haven't
Frankly.
done much to fix it.
No.
Okay, I'm going to change gears just slightly because there's something else I wanted to cover about some of the major trade agreements. And Ailish, I wanted to ask you about the Canada-Europe one because I believe that you're a big fan of it. But I'm wondering how that fits in the bigger picture of diversifying trade. You showed that really nice chart from Tiff Macklin. And Mark Carney, before he left us, had a very nice chart that he used to show that showed that 85% of Canada's trade was with the slowest growing economies in the world. And in those slow growing economies were all the European ones. And so I'm wondering, is the Canada-Europe trade agreement really going to move us very much farther ahead on either diversification or more economic growth?
Right. Well, here's the great news about Canada is that according to the OECD, we are the most resilient economy in the world. And resiliency in economic terms is linked to the diversity of what we produce and the cost of our inputs. And so I'm going to go back to Diane's point really about products and what we produce. So bulk commodities, one thing we didn't surface in this panel that's a huge challenge is the fact that 98% of our energy exports are going through the United States. And obviously that creates not only the pipeline challenges that we've seen, but also price pressures. You can't get the best price for your product if you can only land it in one market. And that's a huge issue for Canada. We've just seen, obviously, geopolitically, some real challenges with Russia. I think there's a huge opportunity for a more constructive energy dialogue between Canada and the EU on a whole host of what we produce. And we're not just about oil and gas, right? We're also about all kinds of clean tech energy, storage, solar innovation, and also smart grid. So there's some huge opportunities there that I think are in the mutual interest of both the EU and Canada. And these are great customers. Canada does produce, obviously, bulk commodities. It's a huge part of our exports. But what we do produce, because of our higher labor costs and our technology, our consumer products, machinery equipment, pharmaceutical products, and where we are in agri-food, of course, it can be quite high-end products. So the EU is a great match in that sense, those customers for our products. But of course, the answer there is to know what you're involved in. We have fantastic relationships, again, in the UK and France. Those are very traditional, cultural, and long-standing. But the growth markets that are present in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, the Romanias, the Polands of the world, where we can use our diaspora to connect into those markets. And again, government has done its part. Now there's an 18-month process that we're going to go through with the EU member states to ratify the Canada-EU trade agreement. We've got to focus on that, but then it's absolutely over to the business community to I think, then amplify that opportunity, as John has pointed out.
Right. So all in all, a good deal, you're saying?
Absolutely a good deal because number one, it's a modern agreement. I mean, my organization is like, let's forget about tariffs. Canada could unilaterally eliminate tariffs tomorrow. It's about $3 billion to the federal government in terms of revenue, so it's totally marginal in a $1.9 trillion economy. Tariffs are really just friction. Tariffs also drive small and medium-sized enterprises not even to use trade agreements. There's a 10-year-old study, and we should refresh it, that shows that only 50% of exporters use the NAFTA preferential tariff rates because they don't want to be bothered with the paperwork. They just use the most favored nation, the MFN rate. So there's a danger there in concentrating on tariffs and missing the really tough issues like product certification, like sanitary standards, like obviously then the whole gamut. We should get into this, I think, too, because it's a huge opportunity for Canada in terms of trade and services.
Okay.
Let me pick up on what Ailish said, if I might, and bring it back to the sort of NAFTA dynamic, because we've been looking at an agreement in NAFTA that's been very successful economically. It's a bit of a political orphan. And how do we go about trying to make improvements to NAFTA? Because it's not perfect, and there are gaps in it. And now we've got an agreement with Europe that's a better agreement.
Yes,
it
that's right.
covers more things, it's deeper. And one of the benefits of this might turn out to be that it's actually going to make the Americans think, when the American business community wakes up to the fact that they're being discriminated against Europeans in the Canadian marketplace, they may begin to decide maybe they really do need to modernize NAFTA. And I think this would open up an opportunity of doing that. For instance, European suppliers are going to have access to provincial procurement markets with dispute settlement provisions that aren't going to exist for American suppliers, to give one example, and there are lots of others.
Okay. Our next panel is going to be on NAFTA, so we're not going to have too much of a discussion here, although I hope you ask some questions at the end of the next panel on that, because I know you have a lot to say. Diane.
Can I add that one of the things that I find is very, unfortunate also for Canada is that the border has gotten worse in 26 years of NAFTA. It's the only free trade agreement where that's happened. By now, given the similarity in the two countries, and I'm not talking about Mexico, I have advocated for a long time an asymmetrical NAFTA. You keep NAFTA in place. Mexico is not ready to get rid of its border, but we should be on our way to a security perimeter, maybe a customs union, like the Europeans did, like the Caribbean have done, like West African countries have done, between the US and Canada. I mean, this is also a big impediment. I now know manufacturers who are relocating into the United States from Canada because that border thickening is a real problem. And there's a lot of reasons behind it. In 2011, the two heads of state announced the talks for security perimeter. This has gone on forever. John would have the insight as to why this drags on these things. Now, they have to talk about blending law enforcement, customs, taxation, homeland security. I know it's complicated, but I think that these two countries would both benefit enormously if we could get rid of the border and do what the Europeans have been able to do and have a customs union.
Okay. That should lead to some interesting questions, which we're going to go to in a minute. I have one last question for all of you. It's quite notable that we haven't talked very much about the WTO at all. That's right. Is the WTO dead?
You're the
John.
expert.
No, although it's going through a bit of a bad patch, and of course, all the sex appeal is with the mega regionals and the bilateral negotiations. But the WTO is still, I think, the critical bedrock of the whole system. And it's still the place where everybody takes their trade disputes. You don't see trade disputes being resolved in bilateral dispute settlement forums, all happening in the WTO. And the WTO is actually showing some signs of life in the last few days. Let me give you 3 quick examples. You know, we had this successful ministerial meeting in Bali that reached agreement on a trade facilitation agreement. It was then blocked by the Indians in terms of adopting the protocol. That's now been resolved, and the protocol's now been adopted. It's moving ahead. And also there's a commitment there by next July to have a new work program for the WTO. Now that could be quite useful in terms of charting the way ahead. The information technology agreement, which is a really important agreement involving trillions of dollars in trade and information technology products. The United States and China have just unblocked the main obstacle to moving that forward to a much expanded coverage to pick up all the products that have been developed over the last 20 years. And that, by agreeing between those 2 countries on the product coverage for the improved agreement. And so that's a very big deal. And those benefits will be put back into the WTO and extended on a most favored nation basis to all countries. And the third point I'd say is that we have a trade and services negotiation going on in Geneva with more than 2/3 of the world's economy. Maybe the Chinese are now going to be let in that they've made this deal with the United States. It's not per se in the WTO, but it's all about improving the WTO agreement. So it de facto is a WTO negotiation. Right. And so I think, and on agriculture, that old subject, you can't really negotiate on agricultural subsidies bilaterally or regionally. You've got to tackle that on a multilateral basis. And the same is true for all the trade remedy stuff. Anti-dumping, countervail, subsidies. It can only be done multilaterally.
John's just put his finger on the reason why I'm just much more bearish, unfortunately, on the WTO, and that's agriculture. Because until all the countries come together, and that obviously includes the United States as well as Canada, but the Quad countries, the US, the EU, Japan, and Canada, that made the Uruguay round kind of the high tide watermark, do not want to deal with the agricultural subsidy issues that are absolutely integral for India, Brazil, and other trading nations to say, we're going to come to the table and do advanced rules, sure, on investment in services, but only if you address far more fundamental issues on basic commodities, agricultural commodities like domestic subsidies. And there's absolutely no willingness to do that. So I agree with John, we have to keep trying to keep the system alive and on life support, and certainly we have to keep the dispute settlement mechanism there because it's viable, but the future is in mega regionals. And I think that's going to be much to the detriment, frankly, to consumers, but also those nations that are not as well integrated in strong regions and in global supply chains, particularly the Middle East and in Africa. Again, a good news story for Canada, but looking out globally, some real risks.
Okay, thank you. I've totally mismanaged this. We only have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm wondering if anybody has like a burning question? Burning question there. Oh, okay. Well, okay, well, there's 2 actually, so we'll do the gentleman behind you and then you.
Perfect. So this is R.H. Bashir with Alberta Agriculture, International Relations and Marketing Branch. And I think so, thank you for the wonderful discussion. It seems that some of the things you discussed are things that we discuss in our office every day. My question would be on the SMEs and how do we encourage them to explore the new markets? It seems that they have the mentality to follow the flock, go to the US, which is perfect, but sometimes the bigger opportunity might be in Kazakhstan. How do we encourage them? And the second part of my question is that...
Actually, I'm sorry, could we just keep it to 1, because really the clock is ticking down, and then it's completely my fault, but maybe you can ask the question during the lunch break to them, your second part.
So
we'll just go with that.
Can I say, you can't encourage business to do anything unless there's a buck in it. It's got to make sense.
Right.
Period.
Okay. We'll take the second question.
Thank you for an excellent session. The session's about diversifying Canada's export economy, but in today's economy, exports are often driven by foreign direct investment.
Sure.
Can Canada perhaps diversify its export economy by being more open to foreign investment, particularly foreign investment from Asia?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Having worked on the Investment Canada Act, I feel well poised to take this question. And I mean, I think what you're getting at is the very antiquated discussion we have about trade. So we have to look at trade, not just merchandise exports, but services. Add in the foreign direct investment that you're talking about, add in foreign affiliate sales. And unless we do that, we're not looking at the whole picture. But specifically on foreign investment, Canada is one of the most open market economies in the world with some serious sector, as you know, barriers. And those are now against state-owned enterprises in the oil sands, in telecommunications, and in airlines. Those are key issues that we need to take a look at. And I think absolutely we need to be open to foreign direct investment. Why? Because it brings in opportunities globally to connect to global supply chains, and it brings in management excellence. And it also exposes us, as Diane is saying, to new customers. It's got to be about where's the next sale.
Restrictions on banking, too.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.